Oh, I think the justice is definitely biased. I think it's dishonoring, you know, the United States flag. If they elected a president, they should be a peaceful transference of government to the correct person who won, and Biden won.
In today's Spotlight, a U.S. Supreme Court justice is under scrutiny. That was a neighbor of Justice Samuel Alito, who is now facing calls to recuse himself from cases related to the 2020 election. This is after this picture was published in the New York Times showing an upside-down American flag flying outside of Alito's house just days after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The flag displayed that way is widely seen as a symbol of the so-called Stop the Steal movement that claims without any evidence that President Joe Biden did not win the 2020 election. Justice Alito says he had no involvement and that it was his wife who did it in response to a neighbor's allegedly offensive yard signs. Let's bring back my panel, Mike, Shauna, and Brian. And joining us now is ABC News contributor and former Republican Congressman John Katko. John, Alito blaming his wife for this upside-down American flag. What do you make of that response from this justice on the nation's highest court?
Well, when you assume a position of authority in the federal government, like I was in Congress, or especially the Supreme Court, it's not just you that has to act in a certain manner. It's your family and people that are with you. And someone in his house put a flag upside down days after the January 6th uprising. And it was an uprising. And that is incredibly irresponsible if one of his family members did it. And if he did it, it's a disqualifier, in my opinion. So it's not a good look, and it fuels the fire for people who believe that the Supreme Court is biased. And ironically, Trump is fueling a lot of this with his rhetoric, calling into question the legal system nationwide. Things like this don't help. And that's what I'm concerned about most about this incident.
Of course, Trump continues to repeat those unfounded claims about the 2020 election. Right. Many Republicans in Congress do, too. I mean, Shauna, we heard today Illinois Senator Dick Durbin saying that this Supreme Court is in an ethical crisis of its own making. Durbin's actually calling for Alito to recuse himself from any of the cases before the court about January 6 defendants, including, of course, Trump's own case about immunity. Do you agree with Durbin?
You know, the whole basis of the court is that they are impartial, especially when we talk about our Supreme Court justices. So the fact that this flag was hanging there really doesn't pass the smell test. There is an air of impropriety that's going to cause people to lose faith. So should he recuse himself? Absolutely. Will he? Highly unlikely, because they are the arbitrators to make that determination.
And he has doubled down. It's not the first time he's waded into this turf. Mike, when we talk about kind of this impropriety that Shauna talked about, this appearance of bias, and what does that do to the public's view of the court's legitimacy? I mean, so much have we seen in polls, and when you talk to voters, a lot of their faith in any of these institutions has been eroded. Everyone thinks everything is partisan.
Elizabeth, that is such a brilliant question. I think you were actually in my head because I was thinking about spanning it out from a 30,000-foot perspective and looking at the constant erosion of our democracy. In decades or an era past, when the Supreme Court would issue rulings, no matter we agreed or disagreed with the opinions, we accepted it. We accepted it that they went through the proper procedures to understand the case and to issue an opinion that had no biases in it. But as the years has gone by, we have continuously seen the Supreme Court seem much more politicized, and incidents like this with the flag hanging upside down, reflecting Stop the Steal, does not do anything to stop that narrative of the politicalization of the Supreme Court. And so I do think it's incumbent of Congress to step in and to enact something that's enforceable in order to save the sanctity of the Supreme Court that was always held in such high regard.
Right, and when we think about this being the highest court, Brian, and this question of whether Alito should recuse himself from cases, we have to remember that he is not the only justice with conflicts around January 6th. We've, of course, seen Justice Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny, who's a vocal political activist. She attended the January 6th Stop the Steal rally just before the Capitol was stormed. What do you make of the fact that it's not just Alito on the court who's faced some of these questions?
Yeah, I think to your point, this is going to drum up more of that vocal opposition as to the fact that the Supreme Court doesn't really have a rule of ethics that it needs to follow. It's very unique when compared to other justices or judges throughout the United States of America. And as we saw with Clarence Thomas and Ginny, as you pointed out, that conversation started. And I think this event with Justice Alito, who is basically throwing his wife under the bus, so to speak, is going to continue that conversation of what rules should the Supreme Court hold themselves as to their ethical obligations, as to when they should recuse themselves or not. Because right now, Alito is in a position to rule on two major Supreme Court cases involving the election, and has already done in the past. So as to everyone's point, it brings up issues of, is there bias in these decisions?
Great point, Brian. And these are such consequential cases before the court. Mike, Shauna, John, and Brian, thank you all very much.